Do lesions to PFC make people go blind? Now then, if we think that the PFC is important for conscious visual experiences, does that mean that lesions to the PFC should make people go blind? The answer is no, they don't. Not really. But there are two reasons why this might not be a challenge to the claim that the PFC is important for conscious visual experiences. The first reason is the phenomenon of degeneracy, which we talked about in class 1.7. That is, when, for example, the left DLPFC is lesioned, the right DLPFC, together with other parietal areas highly connected to the DLPFC, can dynamically take over the functions. This is a bit like a computer having multiple CPUs. When you remove one of them, you might not necessarily observe clear deficits in performance. This is an important point. Throughout this class, we say that the globalists emphasize the role of the PFC in conscious perception. But actually, they usually also treat the parietal as highly related because the lateral parietal areas are densely and bidirectionally connected with areas like DLPFC, the frontopolar region APFC, etc., etc. So the contention between the localists and the globalists really concerns frontal and parietal regions versus early sensory regions. We sometimes call these frontal and parietal regions the association areas. But even if we take DLPFC to be just one area within this frontal parietal network, one might bring up the point that lesions to V1 alone induce blind sight. So doesn't that mean that the visual areas are more important? Well, that is true. But anatomically, V1 is where most subcortical to cortical input goes through. When it's lesioned, there aren't that many parallel pathways for information to reach the cortex, so the effect may be more salient. It's just as one would expect. In other words, the degree of degeneracy may depend on the connections of the area involved. Given what we know about the DLPFC, including its anatomical connections, we expect high degeneracy for the relevant functions, but there are alternative routes. And so even for functions clearly associated with the DLPFC, such as working memory, unilateral lesions often don't lead to clear deficits. Of course, when both the prefrontal and parietal areas are bilaterally lesioned, the subject might just be too impaired to be studied for specific deficits. In fact, even for subjects with only the lateral prefrontal cortices lesioned on both sides, testing them is often difficult. Watch this video to see what such a patient might be like.
Okay, don't do. Okay, has a bilateral grasp reflex. Okay, for sure. Both hands. Okay. Let me just check some things here. I'm going to tap you. It's not going to hurt. I'm just going to give you a little tap. Can you? Okay. I think you can see there's a very prominent, you say 4+ snout reflex. No clear rooting reflex. Open your eyes. Open your eyes, sir. Open your eyes. Open your eyes.
Yeah.
Try not to blink. Okay, open your jaw. Open your jaw. No jaw jerk. I'm going to check him for a palmamental, which is an ipsilateral reflex. So there's where you want to look. He doesn't have that. Remember, the palmamental is not pathognomonic for anything. You can get it just with anxiety. It is. No, I didn't do him yet. He really doesn't have a palmamental. That was just a little facial twitch. Yeah, but he clearly has a very prominent grasp reflex. Very prominent. All right, let's try a couple other things.
But we can use TMS to create mild versions of bilateral lesions. This brings us to the second point, which is that actually disrupting PFC activity does affect perception in some specific ways. The involvement of PFC in conscious perception may not be simply to represent the perceptual signal. The global theorists might have predicted that, but as we discussed in the last section, the role of the PFC might be to monitor how much perception one can do instead. Elizabeth Runis used theta burst TMS to stimulate both sides of the DLPFC. You usually would not want to stimulate both sides of the DLPFC simultaneously because this could induce seizures. But recall that theta burst TMS is an offline method, with the effects lasting for up to an hour. So you can stimulate one side, wait a minute or so, and then stimulate the other. This way, the stimulation is never simultaneous, but effectively both sides of the DLPFC are suppressed together afterwards. Together with Brian Maniscalco, who contributed to the data analysis, Runis found that TMS to DLPFC did not in fact change the subject's ability to discriminate visual targets. So yes, people didn't go blind. However, metacognition was impaired. In fact, Maniscalco developed a metric called meta-D prime to quantitatively assess metacognitive capacity. It was found that after TMS, subjects' metacognitive capacity deviated from ideal performance by more than 20%. Similar studies have since been performed in patients with unilateral lesions to the PFC as well. For example, Steve Fleming found that patients with unilateral lesions to the anterior frontal polar cortex, the APFC, showed up to about a 50% decrease in metacognitive capacity from the ideal level. Importantly, this deficit was specific to perception. In another memory task that also requires metacognition, patients with APFC lesions showed no deficit compared to the control subjects. Therefore, although lesions to the PFC don't make people blind, it suggests that the PFC does play some specific roles that are important for conscious perception, such as the metacognition in perceptual tasks, that is, how well our brain is monitoring ongoing perception.